Hello, welcome to the Radio Academy podcast. Now, if you've missed the last few episodes, you may not know that our regular host and my old mate, Roisin Hasty, is taking some time off to bring new life into the world. Yeah, she's swapping radio for rattles, swapping a podcast for a pram. So while she's away, I'll be stepping in. My name is Christian Hewgill, and I love radio and audio, and that's all you need to know, really. My first guest meets extraordinary people and tells extraordinary stories.
I think some of the first shots that were fired actually hit me. I don't remember much gunfire before that. I think a rocket passed, didn't hit us. Another one hit the front of the Land Rover.
I remember being top cover and being really angry, like beyond angry, and tears rolling down my eyes with everyone in Iraq.
It's a good story. I won't forget it.
Well, it's a bit hard to forget, isn't it?
Darren Coventry presents Tea and Medals, a podcast made by the British Forces Broadcasting Service, BFBS. Fundamentally, it's people connected to our armed forces telling their stories of outstanding bravery. Darren himself is a former military policeman. A slightly odd route into podcasting, then.
Yes, unusual. I mean, I was strong-armed into it, a bit like they used to recruit people for the Navy a long time ago. But I left the military a few years ago and I ended up at BFBS as a video producer. And one of the ideas we had was about telling the stories of these brave people out there who'd been awarded gallantry medals. And, I was part of the kind of development of it, but I never saw myself as being in front of a microphone or a camera. But lo and behold, I was asked to do it and I sucked it up and got stuck in, and 2.5, 3 years later, here we are.
And I'm going to come back to the podcast itself in a minute, Darren. It's just come back for a new series, but I want to talk about you a little bit first. You are an ex-military policeman, and there's a line in one of the podcasts that you use. I think it might have been the very first episode where you say you're used to interviewing soldiers for naughty things, but not actually used to interviewing people for a podcast. How did you find the leap from military policeman to podcast presenter?
Yeah, interviewing's a skill, but as I've done lots of policey type interviews, but I guess when you boil it down to it, it's just talking to people and getting their side of the story or getting their views on things, and with a slight tweak to the techniques. I think it kind of works. We can have more of a conversation in this kind of interview than that you might see on your favourite police show.
And you say you were sort of dragged kicking and screaming in front of a microphone, but you also say in one of the episodes I've listened to that you've always had a little bit of a creative streak. So was it that reluctant, or were you one of those like a reluctant karaoke singer that actually once you're in, you think, actually, I'm really quite enjoying this whole presenting lark? No,
definitely kicking and screaming. But I guess once I'm into it, as long as I don't think too much about what's going on in the production side, sitting, having a chat with what are really inspirational people, the stories that these our guests have to tell are amazing stories. And I can forget about the cameras and concentrate on, just finding out more about them and more about what happened sometimes a lot of years ago. But yeah, I can concentrate on that and forget about the cameras and the microphones.
How does military policeman and former British soldier Darren Coventry become radio presenter Darren Coventry?
Well, I work for the British Forces Broadcasting Service, BFBS, and they also have an academy. So that was an initiative where they were training forces and veterans, service leavers into the media business. And I was fortunate enough to get a position there for a year, and then even more fortunate that I got a job at the end of it. So I made the leap. As you said, I have always had this kind of creative streak. I always like to do a bit of art, or there was always something going on underneath the hood that I eventually got a chance to explore, and was very fortunate that I can now make a living from doing it.
And how was the transition, Darren? Because as I say, let's be honest, it is a fairly unusual one. There's not that many broadcasters that are former armed forces people, former, British military police.
Yeah, well, the British Forces Broadcasting Service, has a long history with the military. So I guess for me, it's not as harsh of a transition as it might be if I ended up in any other broadcaster or any other production company. So yeah, I'm still in familiar territory. I'm just in a slightly different guise.
The podcast is called Tea and Medals. It's made by BFBS and it's available. Its latest series is available wherever you get your podcasts, but also, Darren, it's on YouTube, isn't it? It's brilliantly filmed and it's made completely visual on YouTube. Tell us how the podcast started and what the basic premise of it is.
Yeah, so it is. We film it and obviously we release it audio. And there's a slight difference between the production workflows for the two, just because the audio has a bit more emphasis on the sound design, and the video has a bit of, add a bit of B-roll, and where possible we had some images of the contributors. The concept itself came from just, everyone knows that there are stories out there that don't get told. These military heroes is what they are. They've generally done something quite extraordinary. And they might be well known within their own circles. They might be well known within the military, or they might be, they might make the papers, for example, at the time, but then they kind of fade away. And some of the stories I think deserved to be told, given a new light and told again, and not just fade away into history, or not just be consigned to their close circle of friends.
You don't realise what's happened completely until you get back. That's when you realise how serious it could have been. AS-90s, the artillery, they were actually firing on us.
We always took it as far as we physically could. If you've got somebody who's genuinely dying and there's a chance that by taking a bit of risk you get them back, we were always happy to do it.
Michelle did it exactly as per the book, so cool as ice is what I remember.
There are big stories out there. Everyone knows about the Victoria Crosses and some of the more unusual medal recipients, but there are also the more day-to-day, down in the weeds stories. The military crosses and the distinguished flying crosses are a good example of that, where they don't really make the papers, these stories. They're publicised, as all awards are, but they don't really get the headline. So yeah, that's why we wanted to tell them.
And fundamentally it is, isn't it? It's a podcast with just stories of outstanding examples of bravery. And of course, some people will be happy to talk about moments in their life when they've been extremely brave. But I hadn't fully anticipated until you actually raised it in one of the episodes I listened to, Darren, that some people will be incredibly reluctant to go back to a traumatic time when they were brave. How do you persuade people to come on the radio and tell their stories? And is it a case of persuasion?
It is a case of persuasion, and it's a case of, I guess, working with the contributors, and every individual is different. Some are very happy to talk about their experiences and their time. They've come to terms with what happened. Let's be honest, nobody gets these kind of medals for nice incidents. There are generally something quite horrific has happened. They are saving lives, and in some cases taking lives. So yeah, getting people to talk about it has been probably the biggest hurdle to get over. But for some people, I'll take you back all the way back to the very first episode with a guy called Corporal Christopher Bamforth. And he himself had come to terms with it, but he still found the whole process quite therapeutic for him. It gave him an opportunity to talk a long time after it happened. But one of the things that we try to do in this podcast is to get stories from other people who were involved. And in that particular episode, there were some other people involved who'd never had any spotlight shined on them, never had a platform to tell their side. And speaking to those guys afterwards, and especially from Barney, Chris himself, he said what a therapeutic process it had been for them. And that was good to hear. And that was an incident that I was involved in personally. 19 years or so before we recorded it. And I hadn't seen those guys almost since that day, especially one guy called Pikey. He was injured in the assault, and the last time I saw him was me carrying him and putting him onto a helicopter to be casevaced out, and he very nearly died. So they hadn't really had a chance to talk about it, and for them, that was a real opportunity. And that's how we found a lot of the guests. It's an opportunity for them to almost, draw a line under it.
And we know BFBS are experts in this field, so we know about the duty of care you guys must think about, and not, persuading people to talk about incidents they ultimately don't want to talk about and want to keep in the past. But in the same time, for those people that are very much enjoying the experience, that must give you a great deal of satisfaction, Darren, knowing you're sort of, maybe for some people, helping them make sense of it and draw a line under it.
Yep, and every person's different, and some have, they've written books about their exploits. So some people, it's a platform to, shout about it. But for other people, it is definitely help them to come to terms with it. Or
I think what I particularly enjoyed about the episodes I listened to, Darren, was, I'll be completely honest with you, I'm not an armed forces expert. I don't have a particular interest in the armed forces. I suppose what the podcast does really well, though, is let human beings tell really interesting, fascinating stories. It's far from a podcast just for sort of the military community, isn't it? It's just a really good method of letting people tell really, in some cases, astonishing stories.
Yeah, at the end of the day, these are people stories. And what we found, the common thread is that every single person, almost every single person, they do not want to take credit for what they've done. Everyone, they're part of a team in general. There's very little that happens as individuals in the military, and they all see it as they were just the one who got recognised, or they were the one who was lucky enough to be written up for this award. But actually, it's almost a team effort.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I remember listening to, I think it was that first episode you mentioned, where one of the gentlemen being interviewed. So it shocked me because he was talking so calmly and so matter-of-factly, kind of the conversation we're having now, Darren, and then just said, and I saw my leg over the other side of the vehicle.
I think a rocket passed, didn't hit us. Another one hit the front corner of the Land Rover. Didn't go off, that was spinning around in the road. Yeah, I went to carry on driving and we were slowing down. Lieutenant Starkey next to me said, why are we slowing down? So I put it in third gear. I realised that my leg wasn't even there.
One of those real stop you in your tracks moment, and you go, what? And I think any audio or radio or podcast that creates those moments, you're onto something, aren't you? There are some really unbelievable moments in there.
There's a lot of untold stories or stories that are just not well known, and they... everyone knows about the big, everyone knows about the Afghanistan war, but they don't necessarily get to hear about the day-to-day lives. They don't get to hear about the individual battles that, we're not talking about armies battles here. We're talking about sections and individuals. And that's what I think is interesting about this, is it's really taking it down to the individual soldier or his closest group of, colleagues, and how they live, work, fight together in those cases.
The podcast started last year. The latest series has not long been released. Darren, I know you want to do more. Where do you want to take this? Are there more stories you want to find and tell?
Yes, we'd love to tell as many stories as we can. And obviously, the as we've alluded to, the difficulty is finding people that are willing to, be open and talk about their incident that resulted in them getting a medal. But we will keep looking for people, and obviously we're lining up the next batch, and we might widen the net. We've had lots of interest from overseas listeners and viewers. It could be that that's somewhere we look to tell more, wider stories, but also maybe that's where we cast the net wider.
Darren, I'm so glad you're enjoying the process of making it. I'm so glad you're enjoying this second career you have, and all the very best with the next series.
Thanks for having us, Christian, and thanks for talking.
I really enjoyed that. The podcast is a great example of how the simple ideas are often the best ones and how visualising a pod can add an extra element too. Love talking to Darren, and Series 2 of Tea and Medals is available now in all the usual places and on YouTube with a third series in the works. I look forward to talking to you very soon. Bye for now.